Today, as I say, we're continuing on in the life of Joseph. And today we're going to be looking at chapter 38, which, as a little bit of a disclaimer before we start, this is a strange chapter. But it's in the Bible for a reason, which we're going to see. When preparing, I was reminded of how, so basically I used to grow up I grew up in a Christian home. Both my parents knew Jesus, loved Jesus, and they used to bring me along to church ever since I was a little baby. And I would often go to Sunday school as I was growing up each week. And in those classes, we would learn about the different events and the different people in the Bible. And Joseph, who we've been looking at, he was one of the popular stories, and he's quite a well-known story. Even for people who aren't Christians, quite a few people have heard of this account. And yet, all the times over the years, the amount of times I went through this in Sunday school, the events of chapter 38 were never mentioned. And in some ways for good reason, because this is the part of the story that doesn't get told in Sunday school. And I think there's actually great wisdom in that, is because it is quite graphic in nature, not really suitable for younger people. And going through it, you could think to yourself like, wow, this is in the Bible, and it is shocking. But it is in the Bible for a reason, and my intent to go through it is not to, I don't want to just try and be hip or controversial or just going through it for the sake of shock value. That's not my purpose. My purpose to go through it is because it's part of God's word for a reason, and it's placed in this narrative of Joseph's life for a reason. Because God wants to teach us and to speak through us. So as I've said recently, because we are recording this study, so if there are any kids watching, this isn't the one to be watching. But yeah, let us begin to unpack this. And before we unpack it, or as we begin, I just want to read the last verse that we read of chapter 37, because this is where we ended last week. And it ended with a cliffhanger. Verse 36, now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. And then verse 1 of our text today says, it came to pass at that time that Judah departed from his brothers and visited a certain Aldamite, whose name was Hirah. So last week we ended with a cliffhanger, and if you remember, Joseph, he was sold into slavery by his brothers, and his brothers, they lied to their father, making him think he was dead, and now Joseph ends up a slave in Egypt. But then the author does something we don't expect. The author, who's accounting Genesis and these events, the author completely changes the focus. And this chapter really feels so out of place, because we go from the fast-paced events of Joseph to focusing on the sinful brokenness of his brother. And now it's just this really great shift. And as some of you may know, I'm a big fan of a show called 24, one of my favourite shows. It's a little bit old now, although well, not old, but it was a little bit back in the day. And basically, this particular show, it really capitalized on leaving every episode with a cliffhanger. And as a result, you're eager for the next episode to see what happens. And actually, that kind of model has now been adopted widespread. Most of the shows that we watch generally have this continuing nature to each episode and end with a cliffhanger. There's not many shows we watch now which would be called episodic. It's this kind of continual story ending on a cliffhanger. And as I say, 24, that was its model, and some huge cliffhangers. So now imagine you're watching the cliffhanger of an episode. And what do, right? You quickly click on the next one, okay? Or you're watching Netflix, it has that sort of 10-second thing, and then the next one begins, right? Because you want to find out what happens. But imagine, instead of continuing on in the next episode, that actually this whole episode is dedicated to a completely different character, a side character. It's taken a complete detour, and you're thinking in the back of your head, hey, what's happened to Joseph, right? If you're reading this for the first time, that's what most of us would be thinking of. Hey, I want to find out what's happened to Joseph. But no, there's this quick change. This lens moves from Joseph. It now moves to Judah, one of his brothers. And if you remember, Judah was the brother who originally suggested selling Joseph into slavery. And we are told, as we read in that first verse, that after Joseph is sold into slavery, Judah leaves his family. And we're not given a specific reason why, but he kind of leaves, he goes off into this other area, and as we'll see in a second, he will begin his own family. But in essence, here's kind of a couple, I'm going to kind of lay out where we're going to end up going with this, right? One of the reasons I think that this text is placed here for its significance is that in the next chapter, we're going to read about how Joseph says no to temptation. In essence, we really do have an example of two men, one in Judah, one in Joseph, one who will succumb and give in to sexual temptation, and we'll see with Joseph a man who is able to overcome sexual temptation. And I think that is one of the things which the Lord is doing here, this kind of compare and contrast, because it's so, like, the fact that one chapter, this guy, he sins sexually. Next chapter, this guy actually says no to sexual temptation. I think that's one of the things in which God is teaching us, as we'll see. But there's also some other things as well, some other significant things about Judah, which I think we'll see unravel even over the next coming weeks. With that said, when it comes to narrative as well, always important to note that often the Bible accounts events and doesn't always give commentary on them, as in, like, if said action by this person was wrong or if said action by this person was right. As we go through this text, there are a couple of moments where God clearly speaks and actually acts and says, hey, this isn't right, what this person is doing. But it's always important to note as we go through narrative, sometimes the Word of God, within it, doesn't give us specific commentary. We look at other places in Scripture to help us understand it. And likewise, just because God is recording something doesn't necessarily mean God is condoning a particular action. That's always important as well to remember. But with all that said, lengthy introduction, let's actually dive into it. So here's Judah. He's moved to this place and now he wants to begin a family. We read this in verse 2. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and went in to her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. And she conceived yet again and bore a son, and called his name Shelah. He was at Shizib when she bore him. So here, Judah, as I say, he leaves his brothers, leaves his families, he goes to this other area, and then he marries this Canaanite. And then, as we see, he then has 3 sons. Okay, so marries this Canaanite, has 3 sons. As I say, he leaves the family to do so. He's gone from the family for what seems to be a significant time, because he marries and has 3 kids and they grow up. We don't know the reason why he left the family, why he decided to kind of move away from there and start a new family in this place over here. But now we're going to see what takes place within this family. Just kind of a little bit of a background beforehand. Previous generations, for example, like with Abraham and with Isaac, they actually didn't encourage their children to marry Canaanites. Right? And one of the reasons why that was because, hey, the Canaanites, they don't worship the God we worship, and we want our children, we want the children of promise to know and love the true God. So we see even here in Judah doing this, it's, could be questionable. And now we read this in verse 6. Then Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So here's Judah, has 3 sons, and then he finds a wife for his first son, because back then they generally did arranged marriages. But then we read this in verse 7, and we're given insight into what this firstborn son is like. It says this in verse 7, but Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord killed him. So, Judah finds a wife for his son but then we see that as it says here, was wicked in the sight of the Lord. And so God decided to bring judgment upon wickedness, and he chooses to end his life. Now, we don't know specifically in what ways was wicked. All we know that in the sight of the Lord, he was wicked. And it does remind us that there are moments, isolated moments, throughout the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, where God chooses to end life due to serious evil. And this is one of those occasions. And I think there are a few things to bear in mind when we come across such passages, because the truth is, and maybe it's because of our cultural background, but when we see God bring judgment upon either a singular person or a group of people, at times it tends to grate us up the wrong way. Yeah, sometimes it's like, wow, that's really hard to read, and I just want to give you a few things to kind of keep in the back of our minds when we come across those passages, because you're going to. And I think in some ways it's perhaps natural that we at times do kind of recoil a bit. And the reason I think that is it reminds us that God is above us and different from us, and because we're sinful, broken people, there are going to be times when the Bible does rub us up the wrong way. But the question is, how do we respond in those moments? Will we say, hey, I'm just going to dismiss this? Or will we seek to humbly be like, you know what, God, I trust you see things better than me, greater than me. But anyway, when we come across challenging texts where we see God's judgment, here's a few things to keep in mind. Number 1, God gives life, and he alone has the right to take life. I think this is so important to remember. When God does take someone's life, as we see here, it's important to remember that God is the one who gives life. And therefore, he has the right to take life. Like every breath we have is a gift from God. It's being sustained by God. Without God, we wouldn't be able to live. God gives life. He sustains life. He has the right to take life because he's the giver of life. So I think that's the important first thing to remember. Second thing is this, that God always acts justly. The punishment is always fitting of the crime. In essence, when God does bring about judgment, when he does bring about punishment, he never goes too far, but rather his punishment, when he does deliver it, is always just. It always fits the crime, which really means this, leads us to this conclusion, number 3, that God has a greater moral standard than us, and that our sin is far more serious than we realize. Take this for example. It's like, hey, we look at this, we're like, oh wow, he was wicked, and then we'll see actually, spoiler alert, that the other brother is also wicked, and he ends up, the Lord takes his life as well. And we can look at that and be like, wow, like, did he do anything that bad? But the truth is, God is just. His punishment always fits the crime, which means these guys, what they did, the crime was fitting of that. Which tells me this: my sin and their sin is far more serious than we realize. Number 4. So God gives life. God always acts justly. Our sin is more serious than we realize. Number 4, God's wrath is always controlled and calculated. Like, it's never done out of he loses control, but rather he chooses to act in a specific way at a specific time, addressing a specific issue. It is calculated, it is controlled, and it is not just he's lost control. And then number 5, another thought to take in mind is this: don't take for granted the grace that he has shown us. If we are guilty of the same crime and yet have not received the same punishment, that is simply grace. And he has showed us grace upon grace. Because sometimes we go through the Bible and we're like, okay, Lord, why did you punish that guy, but then you didn't punish this guy? Or why did you punish that guy, but you haven't punished me yet in the same way? And I would say this: it is often grace. The reason that God hasn't brought upon immediate judgment on us at moments in our life is grace. And we actually see that, as I say, throughout the Bible, that he is, it talks about him being slow to anger. For example, when we see him act against like nations or whole cities, that is often after years and years and generations after generations of habitual, communal turning away from God. So as I say, if God has shown us grace by not ending our life, then we should be grateful for that and be like, hey, God, I'm not going to take your grace for granted. But rather, I'm going to be like, Lord, wow, I'm guilty like this. I'm deserving of this. But I thank you, God, that through faith in you, Jesus, you've forgiven me and you've taken the punishment, so I don't need to take it. And actually, I can know you and walk with you, have this relationship with you. Lord, thank you for your grace. So such a few things, as I say, to kind of think about when we come to texts like this, which are difficult. And as I say, on this occasion, God chooses to end the life of and now Judah has to experience what it's like to lose a son. And I wonder if that was playing on his mind. Because think about it, right? Back in the previous chapter, him and the brothers, in essence, lie to Jacob, convincing Jacob that Joseph, his son, is dead. And they saw the anguish that caused Jacob. And now here we see Judah, in a sense of really tragic irony, him actually losing a son. And not just this son, but we'll actually see in a second his other son as well. It says this: and Judah, so Er's been, the Lord has brought judgment upon taking his life. So then Judah says this to his second son, Onan: go into your brother's wife and marry her, and raise up an heir to your brother. So this was a custom at the time, but it would also become like a kind of a regular custom within a Jewish culture known as the Levirate law. And basically, this law was that a man would take his brother's childless widow. So the idea is, hey, if a guy's married to a lady, but he passes away and she doesn't have any children, then the brother could then marry her, and the purpose of that was to provide for the widow, to make sure that she was well cared for, she was well provided for, and then also to continue the family line. And this is what Judah instructs his son to do. But Onan is not thrilled with the idea. So it says this, verse 9 to 10. But Onan knew that the heir would not be his. And it came to pass that when he went into his brother's wife, that he emitted on the ground, lest he should give an heir to his brother. And the thing which he did displeased the Lord, therefore he killed him also. So we see here, in essence, Onan is happy to sleep with his brother's wife, but he doesn't want to provide a child. Because he knows that the heir would not be his, it would be continuing on his brother's line. So when he was intimate with her, he would pull out at the last moment. He would pull out, and God saw all of this, and it says that he was displeased. It says that what Onan did was also wicked in the eyes of God. And so, unfortunately, we see for Onan that he suffers the same fate as his brother, and God ends his life as well. So here's Judah, two wicked sons, and now both are dead as a result of their wickedness. So what does he do with Tamar now? It's like, hey, my first son was married to you, he died. I did encourage my second son to marry you, but now he's died. So what now? And then Judah said to Tamar, says this in verse 11, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house, till my son Shelah is grown. For he said, lest he also die like his brothers. And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. So as I said earlier, in a sense of dark irony, the man who took away a son from his father, so Jacob, instrumental in taking Judah, instrumental in taking Joseph away from Jacob. Now Judah himself loses two of his sons, and he can't bear to lose another. And so he sends Tamar back to her father's house, and he tells her to wait until his youngest son is older. And so she does. She waits. And then we see tragedy strikes again. Verse 12, now in the process of time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. And Judah was comforted and went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hirah the Aldamite. So years go by, and then Judah's wife passes away. Two sons and now a wife. And Judah, he has naturally a season of mourning. And then after this season of mourning, Judah then heads to a place called Timnah. And while this takes place, camera focuses back on Tamar, says this, and it was told Tamar, saying, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. And so she took off her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself, and sat in an open place which was on the way to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was grown, and that she was not given to him as a wife. So, Judah's youngest son was now grown, but there was no sign that he was going to fulfill the promise. You remember that promise that Judah said? Judah said, hey, look, wait until my youngest son is older, and then he'll marry you, he'll look after you, he'll care for you, he'll provide for you. But the youngest son grows older, and there's no sign that Judah's going to actually fulfill the promise that he made to her. And so Tamar tries to take things into her own hands. And as a result, the brokenness of this family and the sin of this family goes deeper and deeper and deeper. The mess of this family continues to explain. And she knows where Judah's going, and this is her plan. A little spoiler alert, but we'll see how it all unfolds. This is her plan. She's going to dress up. She's going to position herself along the way. In essence, her plan is to pose as a prostitute. It says this in verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, because she had covered her face. And then he turned to her by the way and said, "Please let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. So she said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" So here's Judah. Judah sees her. And he thinks that she's a prostitute. He doesn't realize that she is Tamar, his daughter-in-law. And what does he do? He approaches her and he offers to pay her for sex. And this is unbelievably broken and just tragic. This descendant of Abraham, the man, remember, God had come to Abraham and had promised to make from Abraham a family, a nation that would bless the whole world. Now we see Abraham's descendant, Judah, and here he stands, willing to pay a woman for sex. And now some commentators looking at this potentially think that maybe that this wasn't an isolated incident for Judah. That potentially he used to frequent prostitutes, and this is why Tamar knew that if she put herself in this position, this would take place. That could be the case, we're not too sure. But either way, whether this was a one-time thing or a more habitual thing, what is clear is this is wrong, and there is something. This guy is in such a dark place. There's a quote which I've come across before, which I think is attributed to a guy called G.K. Chesterton, although I think somebody actually before him who actually came up with the quote. But anyway, this quote says this, that every man who knocks on the door of a brothel is looking for God. In essence, what this quote says is, look, that every man in this position who's willing to pay a prostitute for sex, their deepest and fundamental issue is that their heart is far from God. That they're trying to seek to fill the void which only God can fill. In essence, I want us to see here that as we look at this man Judah, with all his sin, with all his issues, his ultimate issue is a heart issue. Judah is a sinful man in the middle of a very broken family. And ultimately, there is a heart that is in need of desperate change. There is a heart that needs to be made right with God. There's a heart that needs to be changed. And as I say, this is the same guy, Judah, willing and suggested to sell his brother into slavery. And now we see here, first of all, not willing to fulfill his promise to Tamar, but now being willing to sleep with a prostitute. And we see what takes place next. And all we can see is this is such brokenness, such mess, such sin. And it says this in verse 17. So she says to him, okay, what are you going to give me? And he said, I will send a young goat from my flock. And so she said, will you give me a pledge till you send it? And then he said, what pledge shall I give you? And so she said, your signet and cord and your staff that is in your hand. And then he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. So she arose and went away and laid aside her veil and put on the garments of her widowhood. So here's Tamar, right? So what does Judah say? Hey, look, you can have a young goat from my flock. But she says, hey, look, in essence, to make sure you fulfill the pledge, I want you to give me 3 items of yours, which is kind of like a guarantee that you're actually going to fulfill what you said you're going to do. And the pledge was a signet, a cord, and his staff. So his signet, cord, and staff. And this takes place. He sleeps with her. And then she goes back and she puts on her garments of widowhood. And in verse 20, and Judah sent the young goats by the hand of his friend the Adullamite to receive his pledge from the woman's hand. But he did not find her. And then he asked the men of that place, saying, where is the harlot who was openly by the roadside? And they said, there was no harlot in this place. And so he returned to Judah and said, I cannot find her. Also the men of the place said, there was no harlot in this place. And then Judah said, let her take them for herself, lest we be ashamed, for I sent this young goat, and you have not found her. So, here's Judah. He sends his friend with the goat to find her, to give her the goat, but he cannot find her, no trace of her. There's not even known that there is a prostitute there, so comes back. And then we read this in verse 24. And it came to pass, about 3 months after, that Judah was told, saying, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot. Furthermore, she is with child by harlotry. So Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Now, I really want you to see the double standard here that Judah has, right? Because here's Judah. Judah slept with a prostitute, right? Which is Tamar. And now, a bit further down the line, because remember, Judah doesn't know it was Tamar to begin with, right? A bit further down the line, here's Judah. Somebody comes to him and says, hey, your daughter-in-law has been playing the harlot. And obviously, Judah doesn't realize that she was playing the harlot with him. But what does he say? He says, hey, let her be burned. And I want you to see the double standard that Judah has. It's like, Judah's like, hey, it's okay for me to go around sleeping with a prostitute, but it's not okay for my daughter-in-law to play the prostitute. So I want you to see this kind of, this very clear double standard that Judah is having. It's like, hey, this is okay for me, it's not okay for her. And obviously, it's not okay for either of them, right? Just to clear that up, So he says, hey, look, bring her out, let her be burned. And in verse 25 it says this, when she was brought out, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, by the man to whom these belong, I am with child. And she said, please determine whose these are, the signet and cord and staff. So, as she's being grabbed to be burned, what does she do? She sends word and says, hey, look, Judah, before you do this, the person who I slept with, who is the father of the child, well, these 3 items belong to him. And they were the items that Judah had originally given to Tamar. And now what I also want you to see is there is this kind of mirror between what happened in the previous chapter and what's happening now. Because if you remember in the previous chapter, taking a piece of clothing, what did the brothers say to their father? Hey, from this piece of clothing, who does this belong to? They're part of their deception. Do you remember that? They took Joseph's cloak, took it to the father and said, hey, who does this? Please tell me who this belongs to. And now we see in this next chapter, now that the same thing is now happening in essence to Judah. How somebody now is presenting a piece of clothing saying to Judah, hey, determine who this belongs to. We see in chapter 37 how Judah seeks to deceive their father. And now we see here how Judah himself was being deceived. And I wonder if those images flash back into his mind, thinking about how he himself had deceived his dad. And it says this, so Judah acknowledged them and said, she has been more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah my son, and he never knew her again. What I would like to say is, with all the wrong and the sin that Judah has done and does, what we must at least give him credit for is that when he is finally exposed and confronted, there is at least an acknowledgement in that, isn't there? To the point where it's like, man, what you've done, Tamar, is nothing compared to what I've done. If anything, what you've done, Tamar, is actually righteous compared to what I've done. And perhaps we are seeing here a glimmer of hope. Perhaps we are here seeing perhaps what is potentially the beginning of Judah realizing his sin, realizing he's not right with God, and beginning in the position where heart change is potentially beginning to happen. And it does challenge us. Hey, if somebody confronts you and exposes you in your sin, how are you going to respond? You're going to try and cover it up? You're going to try and hide it? Or are you going to actually be honest and be like, you know what? You're right. I did do this. So it says, as I say, Judah acknowledged, hey, man, I have been wrong. And in verse 27, we then see the rest of the events fall out. It says this, now it came to pass at the time for giving birth that both twins were in her womb. And so it was when she was giving birth that the one put on his hand, and so it was when she was giving birth that the one put on his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and bound it on his hand, saying, this one came first. Then it happened as he drew back his hand that his brother came out unexpectedly, and she said, how did you break through this? Breach be upon you. Therefore, his name was called Perez. Afterwards, his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. And this is where our text today ends. And I think we can all agree, wow, this is a crazy text. And this really happened. And the Lord has included this really messed up family to teach us many things. And as I say, I think some of these main things of this is, first of all, Judah is an example of man giving into sexual sin. I mean, he doesn't even just give into it. I mean, he sins sexually, and and we see it in how obviously he sees her, thinks she's a prostitute, approaches her, says, "Hey, sleep with me," and is willing to pay whatever cost. This is in great contrast to next week when we see Joseph, when the complete opposite happens, right? So here we see Judah approaching a woman to sin sexually with her. Next week, we'll see a woman approaching Joseph, and Joseph is going to say no. Joseph is going to be like, no, I'm not going to sleep with you. We see these two brothers contrasted in their very different actions. And that's very key. I think that's very key. Look, this guy is an example of just the mess that could come about when we sin sexually. It may not be in this specific kind of way, but in other ways there's brokenness we experience. But Joseph, we're going to see, is a man of honor, a man of integrity. And that is the kind of people that we want to desire to become. We want to cultivate in our hearts by the power of the Holy Spirit. There's this great contrast going on here. And as I say, next week it will really magnify the choices that Joseph makes next week. But there's other things going on here. At the end of Genesis, Judah is going to appear to be a different man. There are certain choices which we'll see later on. So you've got to keep in mind what we read of Judah now. But there are going to be choices he makes later on which are radically different to the kind of man that he is here. But there is another thread going on through this. And this is... Well, let me read it to you, because we can all agree, right? This is a messed up family, yeah? If everybody's like, man, I thought my family was messed up, then you get to read this and you're like, man, they had some issues. And yet, the other thread, and the other reason I think why this text is in there, is because it reminds us of how God, in his sovereignty, is able to work his plans and promises through even the most broken of families. We read this in Matthew's Gospel. First chapter of Matthew says this: the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then we have a genealogy. And it says this, and it's, as I say, following the line of Jesus, so going through to David and then through to Jesus, we read this. Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begot Jacob, Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram, so forth and so forth and so forth. Until we eventually get to verse 16. And Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. I want us to notice that this mess of a family is, from this mess of a family, Jesus is going to come. That this is his lineage, this is his ancestry through the side of Joseph's family. And as I say, this is just a reminder of how God and his plan and his purposes were going to bring about our Messiah despite the brokenness of Perez and Tamar. And what I want us to realize is this, no, this is the fact that God brought his son through such a messed up line. God did that not to condone the choices that they made, because obviously God's like, hey, I don't want you to make the same mistakes. But it is a reminder of how God works through even the most broken of families. And that Jesus, in some ways, Jesus wasn't defined by the real bad stuff that happened in his past. Because in his past ancestry, right? Perhaps you have that feeling of, man, my great-granddad was this, therefore I'm destined to be that as well. It's like, no. God is able to redeem, God is able to use, God is able to change. I don't know how broken your family is. You know, even recently on my dad's side of the family, I've found out of brokenness which I did not realize was there before. And as I say, God in his goodness is even able to work through some of the most tragic messes that we make. So, this text still baffles my mind, still perplexes me at times, but it is there for a purpose and for a reason, and may this get us excited to get back to Joseph. I don't know about you, but I'm like, whew, ready to get back to Joseph, you know. And as I say, it's a great compare and contrast to these two brothers and how they lived. But anyway, let's leave it there for today.